In 2008, I was reading at my desk, reading the Metro section of the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, and on the back page was an AP story about these 5 old men who had found each other online. They were all former wards of the Florida School for Boys in the small panhandle town of Marianna, Florida, west of Tallahassee, about 60 miles. And they had sort of pulled a coup on the state. They convinced the Department of Juvenile Justice to let them hold sort of a memorial ceremony type thing on the campus of this school where they had been boy prisoners in the 1950s and 60s. So the state agreed, and there were a couple of television stations who showed up for this memorial service, and an Associated Press reporter who covered this thing. And this is the story that I read, and it was mainly these guys talking about their experience at this reform school, and the things they said were incredible to me. They were talking about being dragged at night to a squat, dank, cinder block building called the White House, where they were forced down on a dirty cot made to bite a pillow and whipped with a weighted leather strap by a one-armed man named Troy Tidwell, until their behinds split open, basically. They told about picking the cotton from their undergarments out of the lacerations on their butts, and talked in a deep way about how this had affected their entire lives, how this had traumatized them even into their 60s and 70s. And upon reading this story, I took the paper over to Kelley's desk, and I always, when I get excited, I hold my dog tooth like this. And so I sort of, I remember, dropping the paper and being like, what the fuck? And is this, and really, I don't know if I said this at the time, but like, this can't be true. And this, again, October 20th of 2008, this is a story that is still going. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the development of that and about what we did and how we worked together.
I just remember, so that story ran on like page 8A or something. I mean, it was like kind of buried inside.
Inverted pyramid.
Total straight, straight news. But there was like a weird picture of a cemetery and a caption that was like, and no one knows who was buried there or how they died. And like that was it. And Ben, I mean, our conversation, I don't remember it being very long. I think it was like, what the fuck? Yeah, go. I mean, which is like the easiest thing as an editor, and the hardest thing sometimes, I think, is just to say, yes, go do that. And I think it's only because by that point, Ben and I had developed this sort of mutual respect and trust by working on stories like the Go-Go Taquito from 7-Eleven. And what is it about red plastic cups? So we were feature writers, right? I mean, I'm underselling it a little bit, but we had never done a big investigative thing together before, or independently.
Not at all. Sort of always felt like I wanted to.
Yeah.
But
like, yes, we'll do this story that's how many hours away?
By car, 5.
5 hours away in the panhandle of Florida as a small regional paper. Yes, we'll do that. And this is, I'll just let you glance at sort of what came out of it, and then we'll go back and talk through the process. So this is it's 7 years of reporting.
Yes.
3 major
On your way.
multi-part series and a number of smaller stories. This was the first one, For Their Own Good, and then 100 years later, and it's still hell. And these are some of the men that Ben talked to in the course of the reporting. Just dozens and dozens and dozens of men all over the country.
So what happened after this Associated Press story ran, which it ran in papers across the country, these guys started coming out of the woodwork. Other men who had been victimized at the Florida School for Boys showed up. Finally, somebody had let the secret out and had told the truth about what they experienced. 2 guys walked into our newspaper office, St. Pete residents, who came into the paper and said, I was there, that was me. And their stories were the same, you know, being beaten bloody by these guards in the building they called the White House. Others had stories about classmates who disappeared, kids who were taken for a beating and never returned to the cottage. The facts of this were sort of sparse. It started digging into the historical record of this place, newspaper coverage, et cetera, and we found that there was this pattern that happened over 100 years. The place opened in 1900, and in 1903, some investigators dispatched by the governor found kids as young as 6 locked in irons like common prisoners. In 1914, kids locked in dark rooms in a reformatory that caught fire, died in the fire, 10 kids. 1918, there was an illness that spread through the school, killing another dozen or so. Nobody knew really where the final resting place was for any of these boys. And so there were a ton of questions. Initially, is this true? Can this possibly be true? And if so, is there anybody alive who can be held accountable for what these guys experienced? So,
you want to go into the?
Yeah, we cast a wide net, and first
Hold
off
on.
was
Hold
yeah,
on.
Sorry.
Hold on. This is crazy town. The clicker is out of control. Okay.
This is the White House where they were beaten. So we decided early on, when we got interested in this story, to like cast a very wide net, to go as wide and deep as possible, primarily with the question, is this true? And once I talked to, 20, 30 of these men who all had the same story with slight differences, just enough difference to make them unique. I was beaten for, because I was picking blueberries, and somebody told on me we weren't supposed to eat the blueberries off the blueberry bush, that kind of thing. Once I got the sense, like, these guys could not possibly be making this up. They're saying the same names, guys who didn't know each other, completely disconnected, lived in different parts of the state, cannot be making the same story up independently. Once we got a sense that like what they were saying was true, and once that was, we had historical records, newspaper exposés over the years that showed this is true. This wasn't necessarily a secret in Florida. The problem was journalists would come in, would expose this neglect and abuse in a big way. It would be a giant splash. Floridians would respond with anger, and then everyone would turn away and sort of forget the place existed. They would change the name of it. It started out as a Florida Industrial School, and then changed to the Florida School for Boys, and then the Dozier School for Boys. And most recently, when we started looking into modern day abuse and neglect at the school, they changed it yet again to the North Florida Juvenile Fun Center or some shit like that. Yeah. So what we decided early on, though, was like, here's the problem. You've got great exposés, and you've got these wonderful journalists who've come in over the years and have held the place to account, and then they forget about it and they turn away. And we decided pretty early on, like, we're just not going to turn away. We're going to invest time and money into figuring out why this place is allowed to operate like it is, and why it's been allowed to operate like it did for 111 years. And during the reporting of this initial story about the 1950s and 1960s, I'd talk people through it and tell them about it, and they'd say, thank God it's closed. And I'd be like, no, it's not closed. It's still open. It's still a place. And so we decided, what's it like now? And this proved a really difficult story to tell because the state threw up roadblocks anywhere we turned. They wouldn't let us talk to any of the administrators at the school, any of the guards at the school, any of the boys at the school. If we wanted to do this, we had to do it all on our own, not through the Department of Juvenile Justice. And so we decided, how do you do that? Well, Florida has this wonderful set of public information laws, and so we decided to go after the documents. Right?
Well, because I just want to follow up on one thing. This is one of those stories, like, it seemed like if you cut one head off, like 2 heads would grow back in its place. And so when Ben would someone would tell Ben no, I'd hear him on the phone, he'd get pissed and he'd say, I feel a big case of FOIA coming on. And
Totally threatening.
he would
look, PIOs, if you ever deal with public records, these people, these media liaisons, they don't necessarily know the law, right? So I would sometimes be like, now Frank, this guy, he almost had a heart attack during the reporting of this. God bless him. Good guy, but adversarial sometimes. Frank, if you know Chapter 119 of Florida statutes, it says if that document is within reach of any employee in the Department of Juvenile Justice, you have to provide it within 10 minutes. And I got no idea. I got no idea if that's true, and neither did he. So just get.
So, a lot of times, so the criticism of editors is you bring them a great idea and they have two questions for you, right? Like, when can I have it? And how long is it going to be? And I think even if it's a huge story like this, or even if it's a daily, or it's going up on the web in 20 minutes, you have to swallow those questions long enough to give the story and the writer just the attention that they need in that moment. So this was a huge project where we were all in, and you want to talk about this room before we move on?
So we kind of commandeered this little closet space at the Times. It's a good thing about sort of the decline of American newspapers. You can find space like this that nobody's using and make it your crazy
like our
room.
clubhouse. And
frankly, I wasn't in the paper like I was used to being during the reporting of this project because I've kind of got a one-track mind in some ways, and this thing was growing and growing and growing, and so I'm pursuing all these stories, and I've not had a byline in, sometimes months, which is unique for me, a different experience. And so part of commandeering this office space and making it look this way. By the way, this is the outline of the first part of the story. And the photographs that sort of help tell the story. So part of doing this outline was so I could bring people in to show them that I'd been working on something, which it was important in terms of buying time.
Look how busy we are.
Yeah, because you've got editors above Kelley. Kelley's, cock blocking for me, but you've got editors above Kelley who are like, where are you guys? What are you doing? And so occasionally, we'd bring them into this room, especially when we needed to spend money, because this was not a cheap project. There came a point at which we knew that the department, so if a modern day kid, that's our executive editor, Neil Brown, and Kelley trying to make a pitch.
So I just went into his office and sat in his chair and I said, Neil, let me tell you how it's going to be.
If a kid in that school, we found out if a kid in that school was being abused, they should have 24-hour access to an abuse hotline. When they pick up this red phone, it rings to the Department of Children and Families, which is supposed to then open an investigation, show up at the school, and investigate this claim of abuse. So we found out that the state had 150 abuse investigations in a 5-year period. That a kid had called, and somebody had checked out their story. Those were all sealed because they're juvenile records. So we talked to the Department of Children and Families, who said, we would love to give you these, but they're sealed. But we're not going to, if you go to court to try to convince a judge to unseal them, we're not going to oppose you. And so we talked to our lawyers, who said it's going to be between $8,000 and $15,000 to fight this case. We might be successful, we might not. So that's decent money for a newspaper the size of the Tampa Bay Times. So we got to get this guy's approval.
So I went to a lot of journalism school, but I ended up in grad school at the University of Maryland, and I was incredibly fortunate there to have for Professor Gene Roberts, who's a legendary editor from the Philadelphia Inquirer, where they won 17 Pulitzers in 18 years while he was there. And one big thing that I learned from Gene was that an editor blocks for the reporters. And your job is to do whatever this person needs to do the best work of their lives. And if that's bring him a burrito in the middle of the night, then that's what you do. But you're the buffer between the reporter and all the bullshit, whether it's arguing for money or promoting the story at the paper or dealing with all the many process issues that come up when you're trying to put out a big series, from like, can you write a blurb for the marketing department? Or like, what should we put on the rack card? All that kind of stuff. You protect the reporter from those things so they can do their job. And that means knowing the reporter and knowing what they need. And they're all different. They don't all need the same thing. So, it's my job to get the money and the time and the space and to sell this story up the chain. But fortunately, Ben is a really good salesman too. So we brought Neil and sat him in the little room, and Ben walked him around the wall and just told him the story. And it was a pretty easy yes.
Yeah, because he has all these guys, all these victims, the photographs are on the wall staring at him, So like, how do you say no to a request for $15,000 when you're sitting in the middle of all that? It was a useful technique.
But the reporter has to give back too. So here's some of the documents that came in, and I just want to note that Waveney Ann, see the blue Post-it notes at the top? She cut them in half to save money.
This is the result of many FOIA requests, and what you see here is, the state wouldn't give us people. They wouldn't let us on campus. They wouldn't let us go see what was going on at the school today. And so I think we asked for like every email in the past 4 years that contained the word beating, abuse, neglect, this handful of words, and they were like, well, this is going to be 14,000 documents, and it's going to cost you $8,000. And
but no matter how compelling the stories of these men are, you can't build a piece of work on anecdotes. I mean, you need more than that. So it was in the records that Ben found. I mean, by going through basements in dusty courthouses or archives, he went all over the state. That's where he found sworn congressional testimony that they were beating kids at this school. Videotapes of kids getting bloodied up today, and guards asleep on their shifts, and roaches in the suggestion box. That came from documents, right?
Yeah. If somebody who came on campus found roaches in the suggestion box.
So like narrative details you find in musty documents too.
Yeah. And then part of it is luck too. We were eating one night at the Ruby Tuesday in Jackson County, and my little brother had come along on a reporting trip with me, and he's having a cigarette outside and chatting with the kid who's the hostess, and this kid says, "Oh, my mother." Blake tells this kid why we're in town, covering the Dozier story. And this kid said, "Oh, my mother used to work there, or my mother works there." And so Blake brings this kid back to the table, and I said, "Hey, give your mother my card." Pretty soon, this woman calls, and she worked there in the administration building, and she had a beef with her bosses. And so anytime from then on, anytime something bad would happen at the school, a guard was caught sleeping, she would phone me and say, "Hey, you might ask for the videotape from Jefferson Cottage from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. on January 21st. And so type this directly into a FOIA request, and sure enough, I get a video of a guard falling asleep and kids running amok in the house, in the cottage. So that total luck, that, like, you couldn't have set that up better. But finding sources beyond the documents was super important.
I didn't take all these photos anticipating that we'd be talking about this at Mizzou, but
glad you did.
I just love this one because every writer gets to this point, whether it's a big story or a little story. I mean, and I've been a writer, and when I was a writer, I thought that I was crazy and terrible, and that I was going to be discovered at any moment. And when I became an editor, I learned that all writers think that they're crazy, and most of them are. And they all think that they're terrible and they're going to be discovered at any moment, and they're just all crazy in their own ways. And so another, great piece of editing advice that I got was a good editor gives a shit, because writing is super lonely, and the bigger the story and the more material and the deeper you wade into that material, the lonelier it gets, because nobody can really follow you there. Nobody can follow you really into 7,000, documents and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of words and hours of interviews. But I have to try. I have to try to make Ben feel like there's somebody else out there who cares about the story as much as he does. And I'll wade in as far as I can. So,
and this first part, it amounted to a lot of material. And my problem from the get-go was how do we tell a story out of this? And this is where Kelley was super useful. She was like, look, we can't have 82 characters in this story. That's not the way to do it. We need a character. We need a guy to help define the arc of this story. So everyone else can be a chorus, but you need a solo artist.
But you can't just have a guy, because it's not a story of a guy. So that was like the really tricky, challenging thing with the story, was try how to make it feel intimate, but also really big and cohesive. So we had a list on the wall in that room of every character and sort of like pro con, like, if it's somebody with a really nasty criminal record, that's a big no, if we're looking for somebody credible, but with a story that's not too out there, like not so horrible that it becomes harder to believe. We wanted this sort of the most universal story from the most credible guy we could find, and we found that guy. But then you have in the draft, the first draft that Ben turned in, it was 11,500 words, and you just guy after guy talking about getting beaten in the White House. And so
it was like torture porn.
Yeah. And so we had to
it's too bloody. Weave
that all together, so you had kind of one major like beating scene with like a chorus of a lot of different voices coming in. And I teach journalism now at IU, where we don't have chairs this nice there. And a lot of times when I edit a kid's story, because I just edit the only way I know how to edit, right? Which is all in. And they'll be like, well, I'll go make those corrections, and can you tell me, maybe I'll try to have fewer corrections next time, because they think it's like math class, like this is Algebra 1. And it's like, no, this is how I show my love, because I'm not going to spend this kind of time on a story that's not worth it. And so it's the stories that are never going to amount to anything that you just kind of, you're like, ole, and you scrub it up a little bit and you let it go. But when this draft starts getting really bloody, that's how you know you have something good. When you start going through draft after draft after draft after draft, wanting to make it as good as it could possibly be. So this is one of the stories that sprang off of this series. We actually took it into that little room and we cut it up with scissors. And we got tape out, and we had the thing like all spread out on the floor. It was awesome. And so these were the cuts. And then, stuff you just don't know what to do with. Like, maybe it'll get back into the story, or maybe it won't. And I can think of at least 2 big series that spun off of the sort of purgatory wall from the first story.
Yeah.
Ben had a long section about a lynching in Mariana in 1934 that became a big project called Spectacle. And then we had
something I string. You go out and you spend.
You found.
Yeah.
And then he on one of those early slides when you've got the outline up in the back, it was like da 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 the end, and then we sort of stuck in red marker cemetery question mark. Like, what are we going to do about the cemetery? We got to come back to that, and that became The Lost Bones, this big 2-part series that just ran. This is just kind of like, it's just showing how messy the process is. But I feel like when the story is so big, you have to be able to see it. So I like to tape the story up on the wall, because then I can see the lengths of the sections, how they relate to each other. You can see if it's, every paragraph is one sentence for 36 inches, you got a structural problem there. Sometimes you can see a lot of big problems with the story without even having to read it, just by looking at the white space. And this is the first draft of For Their Own Good. And I have this in my office, and I love to show it to my students. It's like, this is how you know you've done a good job.
Doesn't feel that way.
That's a lie.
No, it helps, though. Kelley gives you this back. It helps that they've got that we had this history that, you know, that like we're comfortable enough with each other to, like, as we're leaving work, goodbye, I love you too, see you later. I mean, that's true. Like that was a common exchange.
Well, remember, well, and the other thing is, I mean, I wouldn't do this to every reporter because everybody's different, and you have, like, my process on that back end might be the same. You know, I'm always going to read the story all the way through once before I chop it up too bad. I'm always going to look for big structural problems first before I look for little things. I'm always going to try to take out a lot of extra fat and stuff. I'm always going to look for unanswered questions, blah, blah, blah. But the presentation is different for everybody because some people can't handle this. They'll, like, freak out and run away. I had one reporter one time who was so sensitive and so hated to be edited that I had to collapse the notes in the story so that it didn't look anything like this. And I just tried to do everything verbally, like, because it would scare to death to see all those comments in the story. So you kind of have to know what people want. But in our first conversation, I think when you were interviewing for the job, I said, Ben, like, what do you need from an editor? Which I don't think enough people ask that question. And he gave me some, like, ridiculous story about a football coach yelling at you. Do you remember?
Yeah, I was a freshman at Arkansas Tech University, the Harvard of West Central Arkansas, home of the Wonder Boys. And I didn't have any friends, and it was 2-a-days, so August, hot, and I'm walking by myself way early for practice across the football field, carrying my shoulder pads over my shoulder, shirtless, and I hear, "Who is that?" And I look up in the stand, sitting alone is the head football coach, Brooks Hollingsworth. And I said, it's Montgomery, sir. And he goes, "Montgomery, put your shirt on. You're embarrassing the program." So I'm good with criticism, I guess.
So he told me that's what he needs. And so I try to do that. I don't know.
So this, going back to what she said, like, we had just written on one of those early drafts, the cemetery, question mark, question mark, question mark. We didn't really address it in that story because it felt like it was divergent. This should be a story about these guys' experience in the 50s and 60s at this place.
We're going to go through the first, this was the first one. I'll just show them real quick. And then this is the story of Claude Neal well, there were 2 big series off the first piece about Dozier. And the school ended up getting shut down and heads rolled and whatever. And then we did this story about the lynching of Claude Neal. And then I think this is what you want to talk about now.
Yeah, so this going back to this idea that we decided we weren't going to turn away, we still had the cemetery, which was a giant question mark. And the state investigative arm, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, did a cursory investigation and found records that showed 31 boys buried in the cemetery, which marked exactly the number of little rusted pipe crosses that were in this field. And but we had records that showed there were another 50 kids who died in custody, and nobody knew where their final resting place was. And so the state said 31 kids buried there, case closed. And we were like, where are all these other kids? And we asked that question in several stories. And everybody seemed ready to, like, let this die. And we didn't know how to proceed. And so through this weird coincidence, along comes the person pictured here, who is Erin Kimmerly. She's a forensic anthropologist at the University of South Florida. And she had read some stories we did about family members whose relative had died in custody, and they didn't know where they were buried. And Erin had done work excavating mass grave sites in the Balkans and in South America. And when she heard about this story, she got interested and decided to try to map this little cemetery with ground-penetrating radar. And the state was cool with that. Go ahead. Well, she found 55 burials where the state said there were 31, and they were way out. So they were buried in the woods. They were outside of the cemetery, and so she got 55. Now she wants to know who they are, and there were families coming out of the woodwork who were saying, "We want the remains of our loved one back." And so launched a giant political battle that lasted about a year and a half. And Erin finally got permission from the governor and the cabinet of Florida to exhume the graves. And so she's been able so far to identify 5 sets of remains out of the 55 she found and return them to the families. And this is the funeral, the reburial of one of the boys pictured in the black and white. And that's his nephew, who spent about $300,000 trying to stop the state from selling that land so that he could find the remains of his uncle, who died in custody. So the story still is going. Oh, this is a sad day. We just got in the news that we did not win the Pulitzer. So we went for a drink. The fella, the reason we wanted to include this slide, the fella sitting beside me is my dear friend Michael Cruz, who is now at Politico, but I think we just wanted to illustrate the importance of friends. And you can find them in newsrooms. You know, it does sometimes feel like a solitary experience when you get into a deep project like this, but as silly as it sounds, you know, camaraderie in downtimes especially is important. So make friends, you know?
Take care, like be a good friend and take care of your friends, especially the ones that you meet here at Mizzou, because, you know, we feel like what we have is special and magical and beautiful and all that, but we don't want, if you're in journalism school right now, it's unrealistic to think that you're gonna leave this place where you're working with these incredible, talented professors and editors and go off and get a first job and find this. But you don't need to, because no editor is perfect, and no editor is perfect for any one writer or reporter, and you sort of, no matter where you are, where you go, you have to build your own editor. You have to have like a Mr. Potato Head of an editor that you take, you know, this person tells me, that's great, keep going. You know, and this person tells me I'm not as good as I think I am all the time. And this person is really great with ideas. And this person is really great helping me get that last 10 or 15% of fat out of my story. And, you know, and this is the person that sits down and helps me figure out how to report it or where to find sources. And you build this editor for yourself out of pieces and parts. And I'm not Ben's editor anymore by any official, you know, decree. But as long as I write anything, I will send it to Ben to read, and I think he'll do the same to me. And so we all have our...
This is how we met before I even worked at the Times.
That's true.
I would occasionally just like farm out stories that had already been published for advice and feedback, and I think I sent a packet to you. Asking.
And I wasn't anybody who could do anything with that. I wasn't even an editor, but I took his packet and Michael's packet to an editor, and I said, you got to read this. And that's, you know, how we ended up working together. So, you know, a lot of times when we talk about great editing, people try to dismiss the conversation and say, well, my editor sucks, you know, my editor doesn't know anything. Well, you know, I've had editors that were very different from me and maybe weren't a great fit for me at the time, but I never had an editor I didn't learn from. And I never had an editor that didn't have their heart in the right place and wasn't really trying. So.
Maybe some time for some questions here. I expect that there should be some. Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just wondering if anything ever came from those emails that ended up in the story, if you got a lot of responses from that, the public records request.
Yeah, I mean, we had the story. The story was in the documents. We got names from those documents. You know, some of them should have been redacted, and they were overlooked. Some of it you could read through the redaction, and so we found some kids to help tell the story who'd been there in the past couple of years and had been released. But yeah, there was a ton, and you know, they had hired a guy who had been in special education classes his whole, you know, through elementary through high school, and he gets hired at Dozier, And his brother thinks he's being hired in like a janitorial capacity. Well, he was hired as a guard and was put in charge of kids on suicide watch. You know, just all sorts of stuff that came out of that, you know, giant stack of documents.
I read the stories when they came out, but my recall's not perfect. How, if at all, did you deal with the people carrying out the torture?
We tried to get them on the record, to get them to talk. One guy in particular, the one-armed man, his name is Troy Tidwell, staked out his house, trying to just get him to come out so he could talk to us. We talked to his ex-wife, who hollered at me. I wound up convincing his granddaughter. The lawyers had told him don't talk because these guys brought a class action lawsuit against the state and named him as a defendant. So I eventually convinced his granddaughter to talk, because if you just let the men tell the story, he's a monster. This guy is a total dark, sadistic monster, and I wanted him to be human. And so a long exchange of emails, I convinced his granddaughter to talk, and she recalled him taking her fishing. She recalled him, anytime they ate together out, he was what's the word? He was self-conscious about his missing arm, and so he would always sit with his arm to the wall. He danced the foxtrot. He sat in the same row at the First Baptist Church every Sunday. He flirted with the ladies at the perfume counter at the mall in Dothan, Alabama, this kind of thing. And so we used those details to make him, to make him real. But ultimately, he wouldn't come out. He wouldn't come out and talk to us.
He worked as hard, if not harder, to get that side of the story than the story of the abuse. And I got this phone call one day at my desk, and it was Ben, and he doesn't get scared, but he sounded concerned, I would say. And he was sitting outside Troy Tidwell's house, and he said, hey, there's a guy behind me, following me. He's coming up the road, and he's carrying a metal pipe. But he's got two arms, though.
It's hilarious. I'm getting all scared. I'm like, and this guy, I swear, I'm watching him in the rearview mirror, and he's just walking straight toward my car, and I've been staked out there like 2 hours, and he's got this pipe, and he gets to the back bumper just when the tension is there, and he turns and he goes over to the water meter thing, and he used the pipe to lift the lid off to check the water meter. Frightening.
So I know a lot of times the hardest part is knowing which documents to even ask for if you don't know what's kept and what it's called. Tell me a little bit about how you're able to FOIA the documents you got.
Yeah, it was a lot of trial and error, honestly. It helped to have that source inside who could say, there's a video in there's a video camera in every cottage, and they keep it for this amount of time and whatever. And she was telling us very particular things to ask for. But she called once and said, the superintendent, the regional director just had a fight with the superintendent. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but there's a lot of yelling. She came bursting out and slammed the door. I think she's getting fired. And so I immediately get on the phone to the PIO in Tallahassee, and I'm, Frank, I just heard you fired Mary Zahaski. I would like her last evaluation and her either her firing document or her letter of resignation. And Frank was like, I don't know what you're talking about, because he didn't. I believe that. So I said again, I was like, Frank, if you have that document, you're not turning it over to me immediately. You're in violation of Chapter 119, Statute 26 of the Florida Code. And so he scrambles to get this document that he didn't know existed.
This was not our area of expertise.
Not at all.
Neither of us. And so I called one of my professors, from Maryland.
Yeah.
So be nice to your professors too, because you might need them. And he was incredibly helpful with, so one way you can know what to ask for is to figure out what an agency collects. So what kind of blank forms do they have? Do they use? What's in the annual report? So we asked for the annual report, and that kind of tells you what kind of stuff they're keeping track of, and it gives you ideas of what you can ask for. But he got us into obscure kind of archives of Black newspapers in the whatever time period, for example. He just had a lot of ideas about what to go after. And then when Ben was reporting Spectacle, I was up in DC for something else. I went to the National Archives and looked through their files, and I was only able to do that because I'd taken a class in reporting in the National Archives from this guy. So you build your own support system. If you don't know how to do something, you just go figure it out, right? That's our job.
And sometimes it's serendipity or luck or whatever you want to call it. I was, so half of the campus was still sort of an active campus, and the other half had been abandoned. And so there were all these cottages covered with this kudzu that were falling apart, and the roofs had caved in and all that. And my photographer, Edmund Fountain, and I were in one of those cottages, and we're just looking around. It's trespassing officially, but nobody knew we were there. And so I remember I'm in the bathroom, this old, it's an open air thing now, so exposed to the elements, but I go in the bathroom, and in one of the toilets, strangely enough, there's some papers, dry, it was a dry toilet. So I get these papers, and like, what is this? And I figure out pretty quickly, it's a roster of every kid who was there in April of 1988, which is a period of time when the school should have been good. It was being monitored by the federal government. And we tracked down, we found every kid, all but 2 of the kids who were in that class, who were there on that roster. And 97% of them had reoffended after they left the reform school, which is a ridiculous recidivism rate. Like, that's
There was like one guy
who had a good experience there.
Well, no, you called him. And you're like, you're the guy, you're the one,
Yeah.
How are you doing? And he's like,
The only reason he didn't get reconvicted is because he went to the military right after he got
he
out.
said that place was a hellhole.
Yeah.
It didn't do anything for me, but I went to another place and they helped me.
But that's just a stroke of luck, finding something like, I guess go where you're not supposed to go is the lesson, but it was like one of those moments where the beams of light were sort of shining down on the toilet, and
Other questions? I had one actually that you were talking a little bit about those moments of despair that happen sometimes when you're in a long piece. In this particular story, what was the moment of despair, or were there more than one? And I think both for the editor and the writer in this case.
This got really emotionally heavy, and I thought for a while I could just like drink my way through the the depression of like just hearing these stories and sitting across from grown men, 70 years old, who would just cry for an hour while they're trying to tell their story. Just that baggage. Like, there's this guy, Stu Kruger, that stands out to me. Stu he's moved around his whole life. He doesn't have a criminal record, so to speak, after Dozier, but he's moved around. He always feels like he can't be anywhere for any one length of time, and I feel like that was a manifestation of the trauma he experienced as a kid. Never had a relationship, like 4 or 5 divorces, and I'm asking Stu to recount his experience at the school, and he tells a story. We're marching to town. He was one of the good kids who got special privileges. They were going to watch Bridge over the River Kwai, and he and another kid duck off into the woods and try to run away, and they get caught, and they're brought to the White House. And he said the other kid went in first for the beating, and he's sitting there, outside of this room where his buddy is being tortured, and he's listening to his friend scream. And he said he bent over and he found there's a little pebble on the ground, and he just focused all of his attention on that pebble, rolling it in between his fingers. And as he's telling this story, he reaches into his pocket and he's like, I still have it. He's carried this thing for 50 years. And he said, anytime I get nervous or uncomfortable, I just, it's like shit like that, just sad, you know what I mean? Like, it's hard to carry that around with you. And so...
And as an editor, it's easy to forget sometimes what reporting stories like that are like. Like, I'm not the one sitting in the car waiting for the one-eyed man to come out of his house. And God, I'm so glad I don't have to do that anymore. And he's off on the road all the time. He's got 3 kids at home. His wife is pissed at him. He's not eating well. I've got to be aware of all of that, and sometimes I've got to call Jenny and be like, I'm gonna get him some couple days off when he gets back. It's gonna be okay. Whatever you got to do. One of my editors told me, we edit people, not stories, and I've always tried to take that to heart and think about the bigger picture.
You all had an update even last month on the story. Do you want to give everyone kind of a rundown of what's going on now?
Sure. So Senator Bill Nelson, senior senator in Florida, has asked the Department of Justice to open an investigation into the school. That's into the cemetery, because there's still a lot of questions about how these kids died. The remains were not, they were buried in pine boxes, and so the remains are nothing. They're dust and little chunks of bone. So there's not cause of death. The forensic anthropologists haven't been able to determine cause of death, even though they've been able to identify 5 kids based on their DNA. They found buckshot with, or what could be buckshot, a small lead ball in what would have been the hip of one of the boys, one of the sets of remains. So that's spinning it forward. We haven't heard from the Department of Justice whether they're going to open an investigation or not, but we hope. It's in the middle of this. It's weird too, because in the middle of this, it's a new experience for both of us. But in the middle of it, I got an email from a retired editor at the Times who said, "I'm glad to see the Times is still crusading." And at first, that made me uncomfortable. Like, should we be crusading? And I'm more and more comfortable with that idea. Like, look, this is what's right. You know what I mean? Like, we stake out moral territory and pursue stories in that vein.
Yeah, we never called them, the alleged beatings in any stories, because Ben did the work to show that this happened. So,
right.
So we say that it happened.
How much lawyering did the stories take?
Allison was part of every conversation, but it wasn't. She never made any requests for us to change anything that I can recall.
No, they're great. When you talk to the Times lawyers, you don't get that feeling of, oh, we have to be careful or we might get sued. It's all about like, how do we get this story out there? How do we put out the best story we can?
Yeah.
Those are what the conversations are like.
Any other questions?
Ben, just how long did it take between the time that you started reporting on this and the time you started writing? And then once you did start writing, how did you know where to begin?
Well, we decided that first story would be answering the question, are these allegations true? And if so, is there anybody that can be held accountable for it? Who's responsible? And ultimately, Florida is responsible. That was sort of, everybody has always known this existed and then sort of ignored it. So we started in October of 2008. That story ran in April of 2009. The story 100 years later, and it's still hell, ran maybe 2 or 3 months after that. The story of the class of '88 ran maybe 4 months after that. In between, there were news stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Smaller things that we would chip off just in terms of bureaucratic development. The cabinet is considering opening an investigation. The FDLE closes its investigation, that kind of thing. The bigger stories were spread, every 4 or 5 months.
The stories of families.
And then most recently,
what happened to their boys?
Yeah. And most recently, this 2-part series called The Lost Bones, that published just before Christmas, tells the story of Erin Kimmerly, the forensic anthropologist who picked up this case, and it's her arc fighting the state to get permission to exhume these boys, and then ultimately returning the boys, at least a few of them, to their families.
I don't remember how long we spent editing it, but I thought it was interesting. We also took a story that was 11,500 words down to about 6,000. Yeah. And I don't think we fought.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a great session.